Thank you very much. You have to start it.
Thank you, Mr. Dhanasegaran, for your wonderful welcome address. Most respected senior advocates who are representing as the delegates of this webinar session, my dear young lawyers, my dear colleagues from the trial judiciary, Mr. Panivel and others whose names are appearing here, sisters and brothers, good evening to all of you. I am once again conveying my sincere thanks to Sai Law Academy for providing me this opportunity to interact with you. This evening, we are going to discuss on examination of witnesses. A lawyer in the trial side has to face examination of witnesses every day in his career. So it's the most practicable and most pragmatic aspects of the jurisprudence. Therefore, today, with my academic background and my experience for about 2 decades as a judge in the trial judiciary, and the learned seniors who have appeared before me in the courts have enlightened me on examination of witnesses, marking of documents, and how to handle the situations, piquant situations arise in the court, everything. Therefore, today, whatever I have learned, I am going to exchange with you. In fact, I am going to interact with you about the examination of witnesses. The examination of witnesses, before we go into the topic examination of witnesses, we have to see the I think the screen is okay, or I have to minimize it, the screen.
Yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay. So today, the examination of witnesses. While we are discussing on examination of witnesses, it is very necessary to go into the Evidence Act. I would like to give you a small background about the Indian Evidence Act. Indian Evidence Act is the longest surviving adjective code. I would say that it came into force on the 1st September 1872, and as of now 148 years have rolled over. This law on evidence, perhaps the longest surviving lex fori. Lex fori, I would say that lex fori is a law applicable in the courtroom battle. It was drafted by Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, and on the day where it was come into force on 1st September 1872, immediately in the year 1872 itself, there was an amendment carried out. Since 1872, it has been amended 24 times, and lastly by Act 22 of 2018, it has been amended. As of now, we can see the Indian Evidence Act. There are 11 chapters and 167 sections when it came into effect. If anyone asks any lawyer or even a law student will say that there are 11 chapters in Indian Evidence Act and there are 167 sections in the Indian Evidence Act. But we, the practicing advocate, we the lawyers, day in and day out applying the provisions of the Indian Evidence Act, has to do an anatomy of the Indian Evidence Act. I would like to request you to go into section 82 of the Indian Evidence Act. Section 82 of the Indian Evidence Act is a presumption as to document admissible in England without proof of seal. So this provision, after the India got independence and became a republic in 1950, the section 82 has become a redundant. It is not, we are not going to apply the section 82 in our courts. And then section 88, presumption as to telegraphic messages. The telegraphic messages, with the practice of sending telegrams, have almost over. It was in the year 2017, the telegram has come to an end. Therefore, section 82 and 88, both these sections are not applicable. And one more section is there, section 166 of the Evidence Act, which is coming under the examination of the witnesses. 166 of the Evidence Act is power of jury or assessor to put questions. All of us very well know that the practice of jury, the jury system was abolished in 1960 after the famous KM Nanavati versus state of Maharashtra. The Nanavati case, all of you know it very well, that it was a case, last trial. It took place year 1962, Supreme Court, page 605. It has been reported. With that, the jury system has come to an end. Therefore, section 88, section 82, section 166, these three sections are not now much useful for the at present in the Indian Evidence Act. Therefore, from the 166 sections, these three sections we can exclude them for our practical purposes. So after the 24 times of amendments, 17 new sections have been incorporated as subsections. For example, see, there are too many A sections. (81A). With the 81, section 81A is incorporated. With that, sir, there are as many as 17 sections are incorporated by 24 amendments, and now that there are 184 sections in the Indian Evidence Act. As I told you earlier, we know that it came into effect on 1st of September 1872 prior to independence. So after the independence, after the Constitution came into effect in 1950, Indian Evidence Act was placed in the concurrent list as entry number 12 in the 7th schedule. This is the present scenario of the Indian Evidence Act, where we are going to discuss the examination of witnesses. With this understanding and background of the Indian Evidence Act, I would like to invite one of the historical perspectives of the Evidence Act. The famous Sipai Mutiny was occurred in 1857. After 1857, the British administration wanted to enact laws for the administration of justice in India. Therefore, in a short span, in 1860, Indian Penal Code, and then new old CRPC, and thereafter in 1872, Indian Evidence Act. It was all drafted in within 2 decades of from the since the Sipai Mutiny. The purpose of enacting the Indian Evidence Act was, there was no uniformity, there was no uniform rule in India, there was no uniform procedure in India applicable for the purpose of administration of justice. Therefore, a uniform procedure has to be introduced from in the Indian territory. That was the major purpose. And then the evidence has to be adduced by the witnesses to be tested by applying certain yardsticks. Therefore, the purpose of the Indian Evidence Act has to be understood in the light of a Latin maxim, as explained in Latin maxim, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. Falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus is the false in one thing, false in everything. This principle is not applicable in India. Therefore, the Supreme Court in Nathu Singh Yadav versus State of Madhya Pradesh, 2002, 10 SEC, 10 SEC, page 366. 2002, 10 SEC, page 366. The Nathu Singh Yadav case, the Supreme Court has said that as the falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus is not applicable in India, the evidence adduced by the witness may be with grain of untruth, exaggerations, embroideries, and embellishments. The court has to separate the grain from the chaff. The court has to separate the grain from the chaff. That was the aim for which the Indian Evidence Act was enacted, for the purpose of courtroom trial. The Indian Evidence Act is applicable in the courtroom. It is for the purpose of courtroom. Therefore, it has been called as lex fori. And the examination of witnesses are governed by Chapter 9 of the Indian Evidence Act, sections 118 to 134. What is section 118? 118 says, all persons shall be competent to testify unless the court consider that they are prevented from understanding the questions put to them or from giving rational answers to those questions by tender age, extreme old age, disease, whether of body or mind, or any other cause of the same kind. Therefore, as per section 118 of the Indian Evidence Act, there was no age limit prescribed. And then any person who can able to understand the questions put to them and can give a logical answer may be a witness. This is the only disability that has been prescribed to become a witness under the Indian Evidence Act is due to a tender age, or due to extreme old age, or due to sickness, or due to disease. If the person is unable to understand the questions put to him, and if he is unable to give a rational answer to the questions put to him, then he is not entitled to become a witness. Therefore, any person who is capable of understanding the questions put to him, and the person who is capable of giving a rational answer to the questions is entitled to become a witness. And then a witness is entering into the witness box for the purpose of giving oral evidence. Therefore, the next question may arise whether a person unable to communicate verbally, a person who is a physically challenged person, could not speak, can become a witness. That may be an incidental question raised by the delegates. Under section 119 of the Indian Evidence Act, a witness who is unable to speak may give his evidence in any other manner in which he can make it intelligible, as by writing or by signs, but such writings must be written and signed to be made in the open court. Therefore, section 119 has make a person who could not speak can also come and enter into the witness box and give oral evidence. How? With the help of a sign language or with the writing, he can make it in the open court. But the only basic requirement under section 119 is that the person who is unable to speak has to do the writing or sign language only in the open court. Previously, section 119, there was a word dumb witness was used. Now, the dumb witness was removed by an amendment, and it has been inserted that a person who is unable to speak, that was inserted in section 119. Now that for the purpose of recording the evidence, of a person who is unable to speak, an interpreter can be engaged. This is one aspect of the case. The basic requirements under section 118 is no age limit. Anybody who is able to understand the questions put to him and who is capable of giving a logical answer can become a witness. And a person who is unable to communicate verbally can also become a witness, and he can enter into the witness box by making a sign or by making a writing in the open court. Now that I would like to put a questions to the delegates here. The moment witness entered into it was a case PW1 and PW2. PW1 is the de facto complainant. PW2 is his friend who has also got injuries in the occurrence. Now that PW1 has entered into the witness box, PW2 is now remaining in the court hall. PW2 is remaining in the court hall. He has to be examined. PW1 is in the witness box. The defense counsel is opposing. While I am cross-examining PW1, who is the de facto complainant in this case, the person who is supposed to be examined as the next witness should not be there should not remain in the court hall. This was the opposition raised by the defense counsel. We all know that whenever a witness is being examined in the court hall, the court staff used to call them. Staff used to tell other witnesses may remain in a distance from the court hall. This is the practice we are adopting it. The witnesses who are yet to be examined by the court cannot remain in the court hall. We are adopting the practice since the inception of the court. But where is the provisions in the Indian Evidence Act? Tomorrow, if a witness who is supposed to, I want to know because I am also an injured in this case, so I want to be in the court hall. If a witness is very adamant, what will be the answer of a public prosecutor, or what will be the situation of a court? It was decided by a decision of the Kerala High Court. Dr. Kasi Iyer versus State of Kerala. The judgment is reported in 1966 Criminal Law Journal, page 1445. It's a very historic case. It is a case where Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer appeared as an advocate in this case. When Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer was an active practicing advocate in Kerala, he was appearing for Dr. Kasi Iyer in a sessions case at Thiruvananthapuram Sessions Court. The prosecutor was examining the witnesses. At the time of examination of witnesses, the names of the persons whose names are cited as witness in the final report were allowed to remain in the court hall by the judge. It was opposed by the Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer at the time, who was an advocate appearing for the Dr. Kasi Iyer. But the district judge has allowed that. What is wrong in it? After all, he is a witness in this case. He is the next witness. We are going to examine him as a next witness in this case. Therefore, he has to remain in the court hall, and the district judge has allowed him to remain in the court hall. Ultimately, what happened? he filed a petition before the Justice Krishna Iyer as advocate filed a petition before the district judge and asked the district judge to pass an order in it that when a witness is examined, the other witnesses of the same case should not remain in the court hall. But the petition was rejected. Immediately, Justice Krishna Iyer as advocate preferred an CRB before the Kerala High Court. In the Kerala High Court, it was decided that though there is no provision in the Indian Evidence Act, though there is no no provisions in the Indian Evidence Act, it is to be discussed that the Halsbury's law of England was quoted and at last said that the witness who is yet to be examined as a witness in the same case should not be allowed to remain in the court hall. So this practice that we are adopting in the court was laid down by the Kerala High Court following the Halsbury's law and practice in England, for which Justice Krishna Iyer as advocate has laid the foundation. This is the thing is that how to accommodate the witnesses in the court hall. And now that witnesses are very important players in the judicial system who help the judges in arriving at correct factual findings. The instrument of evidence is the medium through which facts, either disputed or not disputed, required to be proved, are effectively conveyed to the court. This evidence in the form of documentary or oral is given by the witnesses. Therefore, witnesses' role is extremely important role the witnesses are playing. That is what the observation of the Supreme Court in a judgment in Mahendra Chawla versus Union of India decided on 5th December 2018. It was a case decided by the Supreme Court on 5th December 2018, Mahendra Chawla versus Union of India. This is just to, I am showing it to you why the witnesses are so important to courts. So now that I would like to request you one more questions. How many witnesses are required to prove or disprove a particular fact? Since we are discussing the examination of witnesses, is there any basic requirement under the Evidence Act to prove a particular fact? Any number of witnesses is mandatory under the Indian Evidence Act? I would like to refer section 134 of the Indian Evidence Act. No particular number of witnesses shall in any case be required for the proof of any fact. Shall in any case be required for the proof of any fact. Section 134 made it very clear that no particular number of witnesses shall in any case be required to prove any fact. The Indian legal system has emphasized that value and quality of the evidence rather than on quantity and plurality of witnesses. It is a single witness testimony is sufficient. That was the rule there. A famous case, Vadivelu Thevar versus State of Madras, AIR 1957, Supreme Court, page 614. It is a famous case. It's a very, very important rule under section 134 has been incorporated in this judgment. As a general rule, a court and may act on the testimony of a single witness, though uncorroborated. One credible witness outweighs the testimony of any number of witnesses of indifferent character. This is what section 134 says. Even a single witness testimony is enough. No number has been prescribed to prove a fact or to disprove a particular fact. But the witnesses are adducing oral evidence. It has been classified into three categories. The Vadivelu Thevar case has classified the oral evidence adduced by the witnesses wholly reliable, wholly unreliable, and neither wholly reliable nor wholly unreliable. This is the three category of evidence, oral evidence adduced by the witnesses. It is a very interesting case. It happened in 1957 in it was a case where the second show after 9:30, a show was in progress in a small theater there in a Muthupete village. During the uh, intermission period in the film, in the movie, at about 11:30 p.m., where there was one tea stall owned by Kannusamy, husband of Dhanabhagya. Some people came and they murdered Kannusamy. The sole eyewitness was his wife, the deceased wife, Dhanabhagya. There were other witnesses on the other aspect, but there was only one eyewitness. The one ocular witness was the wife of Dhanabhagya, wife of the deceased, namely Dhanabhagya. That evidence was accepted, and the court has also held in 1957. No question, the corroboration is not at all mandatory if the court accept the evidence after prudent and careful examination of the content of the evidence. Therefore, what is our rule is that under section 134, there is no number of witnesses prescribed to prove a particular fact. The examination of witnesses can be summed up by these provisions. Any persons capable of understanding the question and giving logic answer can be a witness. A person who is unable to speak also become a witness under section 119. And the next thing is section 120 of the Indian Evidence Act. Under 120 of the Evidence Act, the husband or wife to husband, I mean the spouses, are competent to let evidence of either parties, both in civil cases as well as in criminal cases. Under section 120, the husband is the competent witness for wife. Equally, the wife is the competent witness for husband. That is it. And another important thing is we have to switch over to Indian to Code of Criminal Procedure, because whether an accused can be treated as a witness for on the side of the defense, there is no express provision in the Indian Evidence Act. Under section 315 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, an accused person can also be treated as a witness. And then very important aspect of the another aspect is that there are certain persons who are a judge, a magistrate. They are all privileged witnesses in respect of the matters occurred in their presence while he was acting in his capacity of a judge or magistrate under section 121. A judge or magistrate with an order on the order of a superior to him can be also made as a witness under section 121 in respect of the matter which occurred in his presence. The another person who can also become a witness is an expert. An expert who is specially a skilled person to express an opinion, he can also become a witness. And then a person or an official for the production of document may be also made as a witness. And then a person who is not a party to the suit for the purpose of mere production of documents under section 130, he can also become a witness. Above, last one is section 133 of the Indian Evidence Act, which deals with the accomplice. Accomplice is an approver. An approver, whether an approver can become a witness is the interesting question. Under section 133 of the Indian Evidence Act, there is no bar for an approver to become a witness. The Evidence Act has made it very clear. An accomplice shall be a competent witness against an accused person, and the conviction is not illegal merely because it proceeds upon the uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice. So the Evidence Act has made it very clear under section 133. An accomplice or an approver is also a competent witness, and on the basis of the evidence of an approver, the conviction is also maintainable. Under this aspect, one more clarification I would like to make it. One of the famous case on the point I would like to make it that it was a very sensitive case. Sudevanand versus state through CBI. It was a case decided by the Supreme Court. Sudevanand versus state through CBI, decided on 19th January 2012 by the Supreme Court of India. It's a very sensitive case. The case was on 20th March 1975. The then Chief Justice of India, Honorable Mr. Justice A.N. Ray, in his car, he was traveling just near the Supreme Court campus. At that time, near a Tilak Marg in New Delhi, near the Supreme Court of India, where two live hand grenades bomb were lobbed inside the car. Fortunately, the grenades did not explode, and the occupants of the car, including the Chief Justice of India and the driver and his relatives, were escaped unharmed. It was a case where in 1975 there was an attempt to the life of the Chief Justice of India was taken place on March 20, 1975. In this case, the conviction was solely based on the approver's evidence. When we are talking about the approver, an incidental questions may arise that whether a person who is a juvenile can be made as an approver. The answer is absolutely there is no bar. A juvenile can also be made as an approver. The person approver is not precluded from appearing as a witness, and there is no bar for treating him as a witness. A juvenile in country with law may also be treated as an approver. Absolutely, there is no bar for treating him as the juvenile who became an approver after tender of pardon to treat him as a witness. Raj Ambari Sen versus State of West Bengal. Raj Ambari Sen versus State of West Bengal, 2003, Criminal Law Journal, page 3832 is the case reported. 2003, Criminal Law Journal, page 3832. These two cases are how the earlier I have said Sudevanand versus CBI, criminal appeal number 174 of 2012, decided on 19/1/2012 by the Supreme Court. In both the cases, the Honorable Supreme Court has discussed who is an approver, how an approver's evidence can be, how he can treat him as a witness, and what is the evidentiary value attached with the evidence adduced by an approver. All these aspects are very elaborately discussed in this case. The question is there any necessity for the court to videograph the evidence? Normally, the postmortem nowadays, when there is a custodial death or any other suspicious death or any other sensational cases, the postmortem or autopsy being conducted by the doctors are videographed. When an oral evidence is recorded in the open court, does it require to be videographed? Yes, under Section 190 of the Indian Evidence Act, if a person who is unable to speak, who is unable to communicate verbally, adduce evidence with the assistance of an interpreter or special educator by making it a writing or making it through sign language, the evidence recorded with the help of the interpreter shall be recorded, shall be videographed, though it is recorded in the open court. That is the there is the mandatory duty of the court under Section 119 of the Indian Evidence Act. Therefore, where is the necessity for a court to videograph its own evidence recording process? Under Section 119, when a person who is unable to communicate verbally enters into the witness box as a witness and adduces evidence with an aid of an interpreter, those interpretations, those sign language or any other special intelligible manner how he is adducing evidence has to be videographed by the court under Section 119 of the Indian Evidence Act. Then, as I have already stated, an approver can be examined as a witness, and this is an important aspect of the examination of witnesses, whether a witness has a right to maintain silence. Under Article 20, subclass 3, 3 of the Constitution of India, an accused has a right to maintain silence. There is a protection given to a witness, to an accused, from self-incrimination. But in Section 132 of the Indian Evidence Act, we have to read it very carefully, because whether a witness has a right to maintain silence is an important question that has been very recently decided. Witness not excused from answering on ground that answer will criminate. A witness shall not be excused from answering any question as to any matter relevant to the matter in issue in any suit or in any civil or criminal proceedings, upon the ground that the answer to such question will incriminate or may tend directly or indirectly to criminate such witness, or that it will expose or tend directly or indirectly to expose such witness to a penalty or forfeiture of any kind. Section 132 of the Evidence Act has to be read along with Section 147 of the Evidence Act. Section 132 has to be read along with Section 147 of the Evidence Act. 147 of the Evidence Act states that if any such questions relate to a matter relevant to the suit or proceedings, the provisions of Section 132 shall apply thereto. Therefore, section 132 and section 147 has to be read together when witness to be compelled to answer is 147. The decision on the point is decided by the Madras High Court in Saranya versus State. Saranya versus State is a case where the point has been decided. It is a case where a witness is maintaining silence. He is refusing to answer. He is not only maintaining silence, he is refusing to answer the questions. Justice P.N. Prakash, in his judgment, has quoted the earliest judgment of the Madras High Court, reported in ILR 3 Madras 271, and discussed the protection available to an accused in maintaining silence and whether the accused is liable to answer the question or not was discussed there. And in his judgment in para 36, witness cannot refuse to answer a question on the ground that the answer is likely to incriminate him. If he gives a false answer, he will be liable for penal consequences for giving false evidence. The scope of section 132 of the Indian Evidence Act came up before a 5-judges bench before this court in Queen versus Gopal Das, ILR 3 Madras 271. There was a 3 judges held that compulsion under section 132 by the court, and the minority view was taken by Kernan and Muthusamy, the first judge of the Madras High Court. Muthusamy has held that the compulsion is by law and not by the court. The compulsion is bestowed upon the witness by law, and therefore there is a legal compulsion on the witness who takes witness stand to answer any question that is put to him on a relevant fact, and he does not enjoy any right of silence like an accused. An accused may enjoy the right of silence. The accused may maintain the silence, but the witness who takes the witness stand cannot enjoy the right of silence like an accused, and he has to depose and he has to answer the question. This was the answer given in Saranya versus State 2016 2 Law Weekly Criminal page 665. Therefore, a witness cannot maintain a right to silence. This is yet another important aspect. The witness cannot maintain silence is a very important aspect for a practical lawyer, because many of the witnesses are nowadays not answering. It is very difficult to extract certain facts from the mouth of the witnesses. And then there are certain persons entitled certain privileged witnesses. There are privileged witnesses and privileged evidence. As I have said, a judge or magistrate under section 121, the state officials from giving evidence derived from unpublished official records, the magistrates and revenue officers and police officers about any information as to commission of offense under section 125 Indian Evidence Act, the public officer about officially confidential facts and records under section 124, and then come to the professional communication of the lawyers with their clients under section 126. The interpreters are also exempted from revealing, disclosing certain facts. Here, the Indian Evidence Act has used the two words Under section 126, the word lawyer has been used. Under professional, no barrister, attorney, pleader, vakil shall at any time be permitted unless with his client's express consent to disclose any communication made to him in the course and for the purpose of his employment, such as barrister, pleader, attorney, vakil, or all those things in one. Another section is that 129, confidential communication with the legal advisor. Two words are used. One is the barrister, attorney, vakil, pleader, and legal advisor. Legal advisor are the advisors who are advising to the client on the outside of the premises of the court. So the legal advisors are also protected under section 129 from any way disclosing the court any confidential communication which they have received in their professional capacity from their client. And then there are certain immunities, or there are certain privileges as available to a witness under section 130. Under 130, a person is no witness who is not a party to the suit shall be compelled to produce his title deeds to any party or any document in virtue of which he holds any property as pledgee, mortgagee, or any document the production of which might tend to criminate him, unless he has agreed in writing to produce them with persons seeking the production of such deeds or some persons through whom he claims. Therefore, there is a person who is not a party to the suit. When he is not a party to the suit, he shall not be compelled to produce his title deeds or title deeds of any property which he holds in the capacity of pledgee or mortgagee or any other capacity, if those production might tend to criminate him. Therefore, a non-party to the suit is also protected from producing the documents which might criminate him. The same thing is applicable to section 131, which is the electronic records. They are all privileged persons and privileged documents. Then, this is the procedure when a witness cannot be compelled to produce the documents. Under section 130, a person cannot be compelled to produce the document if he is not a party to the suit and if the production of document might tends to incriminate him. With that, sir, section 130 to be understand with section 162 of the Indian Evidence Act. Section 130, which is given a protection to a non-party to the suit from producing the document, has to be read with section 162 of the Indian Evidence Act. A witness summoned to produce a document, section 162, shall, if it is in his possession or power, bring it to court, notwithstanding any objection which there may be to its production or to its admissibility. The validity of any such objection shall be decided on by the court. A witness was summoned to produce a document and he has brought it to the court. Then an objection as to production and its admissibility was raised by the other side. In such occasions, the validity of any such objection shall be decided on by the court. The court, if it thinks fit, may inspect the document unless it refers the matter of state or other evidence to enable it to determine on its admissibility. Therefore, 130 and 162 has to be read together. Both the sections are dealing with a person who are not the parties to the suit, summoned by either parties of the suit for production of document. These sections are non-parties, applicable to the non-parties. And then we shall move on. The summoning of a witness. A witness summoned by the court is not the how to summon a witness, the pro forma of summons are not there in the Indian Evidence Act. Where are they? If it is a civil suit, section 130 and 162 of the Indian Evidence Act shall be read with order 16, rule 6 and 7 of CPC. If it is a civil suit, section 130 and 162, under which we need documents from the person who is not a party to the suit, the party has to be summoned under order 16, rule 6 and 7 of the CPC. The analogy adopted for section 130 is applicable to 131. The fact that the summon has to be served whom and what is the procedure, these things are governed by the Code of Civil Procedure. Therefore, the examination of witnesses, when the question of examination of witnesses comes, the Indian Evidence Act has made it clear that the order of production and examination of witnesses shall be regulated by the law and practice for the time being relating to civil and criminal procedure, respectively, and in absence of any such law, by the discretion of the court. Therefore, the order of production of document into court or examination of witnesses are not governed by the Indian Evidence Act. If it is a civil suit, as I said, order 16, rule 6 and 7 of the CPC is applicable. Therefore, the under section 135 of the Indian Evidence Act, the order in which the witnesses are produced and examined shall be regulated by the law and practice for the time being relating to civil and criminal procedure, respectively. And in the absence of any such, if there is no such a procedure in any circumstances or in any special statute, then by the discretion of the court. Now that when document is tendered as evidence, we know that document is being, one part is tendered, the other part is marked, the third part is proving. Therefore, three important phases are involved in the production of documents, production or tendering a document, and then the document is marked through a competent witness, and thereafter we are proving the contents of the document, the genuineness of the document, and other aspects of the document, attestation, execution, registration. These aspects we are proving through a competent witness. There are three phases in production, marking, and admissibility and relevancy. When a party produces a document, but the other side has objected it on the ground that the document is inadmissible in evidence. So the objection has to be decided in the light of the guidelines given by the Bipin Shantilal Panchal versus State of Gujarat 2003 1 SEC page 1. This is a landmark judgment about the marking of documents, where an objection as to marking of document is raised by a party. The objection, if the objection is not relating to the stamp duty or registration, if the objection is not relating to stamp duty or registration, the objections raised by the party and the answer or the response given by the party who is producing the document has to be recorded, and at the final determination of the suit or the case, a finding has to be given by the trial judge. Whereas, if the objection pertains to insufficient stamp or want of stamp duty penalty or want of registration, or if the document is compulsorily registrable under the Indian Registration Act, whereas the party has tendered an unregistered document, those objections has to be decided then and there by the court. That is the guideline given by the Bipin Shantilal Panchal versus State of Gujarat in 2003, 1 SCC page 1. Therefore, a judge has to decide the admissibility of evidence. The entire discretion has been given to a judge for marking for the documents which has been produced by the party about marking and proving. The one more aspect I would like to enlighten and discuss with you. During the course of examination of witnesses, some party we used to tender a notice to the other side to produce certain document. During when the suit is in progress, there might be an agreement or other document with the possession of the other side. Therefore, the counsel on record on behalf of his party may give a notice to produce the document to the other side. The other side may refuse to produce the document, or he may plead ignorance about it because he may say that such documents are not available with him, or he may raise any such objections and he may wrongfully retain it with them, he may withhold with them, he may not produce the documents to the court. The point is, even after a notice to produce the document, the other side may not produce the document. In such cases, if the document is not produced by the other side, though it is in his possession, though it was in his possession, after some time, when he enters into the bars or at the another stage of the trial, if the party produce such document, it cannot be afterwards use the document as evidence without the consent of the other party or order of the court. For example, A has tendered a notice to produce the document which was the custody of B. B has refused to produce it and says that the documents are not available. Then the remedy available to the A was A can produce the copy available with him, or the secondary evidence A can lead them. If at all, after some time, if B offers to produce the document which was not produced, which was refused by him, then such documents cannot be accepted in the evidence without the consent of the other side, I mean the party who has issued notice to produce the document, or without the order of the court. This is an important provision under section 164 of the Indian Evidence Act. A party cannot wrongfully retain a document without producing it into court. This is in another. So the next aspect is, a witness enters into the witness box. Before he adducing evidence, he has to take oath or affirmation. The oath or affirmations are not are not dealt by the Indian Evidence Act. Who has to take oath? When the Indian Evidence Act is silent about who has to take oath and what is the procedure to take oath, everything. There is three persons, all witnesses and interpreters who are coming there as an expert to translate, or who are coming there to translate the sign language, or to help the witness to adduce the oral evidence. Those witnesses has to be, the interpreters has to take oath or affirmation, and the jurors. As I told you earlier, the juror system is no longer in India. Therefore, the jurors, now we can ignore the jurors. All witnesses and interpreters are liable to take oath or affirmation. And now that, what is the difference between oath or affirmation? Because two words are used by the Oaths Act 1969. The Oaths Act 1969. There are two words are used there. One is the oath, other one is the affirmation. The oath is swearing in the name of God. The affirmation is solemnly affirming to the conscience. Those who don't believe in God, the believers of God, can take oath in the name of God. They can swear in the name of God. If a witness is an atheist, or if he don't have any faith in God, he can be administered oath by a solemn affirmation. The formats are also given. See, the witness and interpreters are entitled to are liable to be administered oath. Then who is exempted from administering the oath? If the witness is a child under 12 years of age, the court has to consider the competency of understanding the question and giving rational answer to them. If the witness is not understand the nature of oath or affirmation, no oaths to be administered on such a child witnesses. The newly framed Criminal Rules of Practice 2020 of the Honorable High Court of Madras, which came into force from 1st January 2020. The newly framed Criminal Rules of Practice of the Honorable High Court Madras, it came into effect from 1st January 2020. Rule 50 has dealt with who are exempted from administering the oath. Accordingly, a person, a child below 12 years of age appeared as a witness in a case. The judge has tested the nature of the witness. The judge has put questions, some basic questions, to understand whether the witness is capable of understanding which is truth, which is not truth, and which is fact, which is not correct, all those things. After analyzing the competency of the witness, and after satisfying that the witness can understand the questions and give a logical answer, the court may permit the witness, who is a child under 12 years of age, to adduce evidence. But if the child is unable to understand the nature of the oath, there is no necessity to administer the oath. So the Indian Evidence Act is not dealing with the oath or solemn affirmation to be administered to the witnesses. It is governed by the Oaths Act 1969. The newly framed Criminal Rules of Practice 2020 by the Honorable Madras High Court, Rule 50 is elaborately dealing with the chapters, Rule 9, Rules 35 to 51 are dealing with the oaths and affirmations. Now that in a civil case, Order 18 Rule 1 CPC contemplates who has to begin the trial. Under Order 18 Rule 1 CPC, who has to commence the trial is given. Whereas, as I stated earlier, in the Indian Evidence Act, the order of examination of witnesses shall be regulated by the law and practice for the time being. So under Order 18 Rule 1, a plaintiff shall begin the under Order 18 Rule 1, hearing of the suit and examination of witnesses, right to begin. The plaintiff has the right to begin unless the defendant admits the facts alleged by the plaintiff and contends that either in point of law or on some additional facts alleged by the defendant, the plaintiff is not entitled to any part of the relief which he seeks, in which case the defendant has the right to begin. See, again I'm on emphasizing the same aspect. The order of examination of witnesses has been left to the laws which are prevailing and which are applicable to civil and criminal. Accordingly, Civil Procedure Code and Criminal Procedure Code. Or if there is any analogy, if there is any anomaly, then it is at the discretion of the court. Under Order 18 Rule 1, it is for the plaintiff. Right to begin is bestowed with the plaintiff. If the defendant admits, any of the claims of the plaintiff, then the burden is upon the defendant, and the defendant has to commence the trial. For example, in a pro note case, in a suit filed on the basis of a pro note, the defendant has denied the borrowing and execution of pro note. In such circumstances, it is for the plaintiff to begin the trial. Whereas in another case, the defendant has admitted the borrowing and execution, but the defendant has pleaded that I have repaid the entire amount to the plaintiff, but the plaintiff has not returned the pro note. Therefore, the defendant has pleaded a discharge. If the defendant pleaded discharge, the right to begin the trial under Order 8 Rule 1 CPC is upon the defendant. The defendant has to commence the trial. This is one side of the trial suit, civil suit. Coming to the criminal side, in a criminal case, under 226 of the CRPC, under section 226, the prosecutor to open the case. Under section 226 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, the prosecutor to open the case. When the accused appear or is brought before the court in pursuance of a commitment of a case under section 209, the prosecutor shall open his case by describing the charge brought against the accused and starting by that evidence he proposes to prove the guilt of the accused. So therefore, under section 226, the prosecutor has to open the case, and thereafter evidence for prosecution under section 231 on the date so fixed, the judge shall proceed to take all such evidence as may be produced in support of the prosecution. After that, section 233 of the Code of Criminal Procedure where the accused is not acquitted under, where the accused is not acquitted under section 232, he shall be called upon to enter on his defense and adduce any evidence he may have in support thereof. Adduce any evidence he may have in support thereof. Therefore, section 226 and the other provisions, 231, all those after the closure of the prosecution evidence only, the defense evidence to be taken on. These are all the procedures contemplated for the criminal cases in the Code of Criminal Procedure. In such circumstances, the Indian Evidence Act has given it to the liberty of the court at the law which are all in prevalent. Then, order of examination has been divided into three, classified into three. Examination in chief. The examination of a witness by the party who calls him shall be called his examination in chief. The examination of a witness by the party who calls him shall be called his examination in chief. Then the cross-examination, the examination of a witness by the adverse party shall be called his cross-examination. Re-examination, the examination of a witness subsequent to the cross-examination by the party who called him shall be called his re-examination. And section 137 says, chief examination by a party who calls the witness, cross-examination by the adverse party, re-examination is after the cross-examination by the party who called the witness is entitled for the cross-examination subject to certain restrictions. Then, order of examination. First, a witness has to be examined in chief, then for cross-examination, and then if the party so desired for re-examination, that is section 138 of the Evidence Act. Now, the examination and cross-examination must relate to relevant fact, but the cross-examination need not be confined to the facts to which the witness testified on his examination in chief. Section 138 has said the cross-examination need not be confined to the facts to which the witness testified on his examination in chief. And then, what are all the questions to be put to a witness? Leading questions, any question suggesting the answer is known as leading questions, which a person putting it wishes or expects receive as called leading questions. Leading questions must not, if objected by the adverse party, be asked in examination in chief and re-examination except with the permission of the court. When a questions carried the answer, that questions will be called as a leading questions, and the leading questions cannot be asked by a party in the chief examination or in the re-examination if the other side object it or with the leave of the court. And then leading questions when can be asked? Leading questions may be asked in the cross-examinations. These are all the important, but these are all in day-to-day practice. We are scrupulously adhering what is chief examination, what is leading questions, why cross-examination, why cross-examinations may be sometime may not be with some material facts, leading we can put, and all those things are discussed in. There are two important aspects which I would like to share with you about section 145 and 157. A practicing lawyer has to think it as a food for thought. A practicing lawyer has to take it as a food for thought. Under section 145, there is a word used, previous statement in writing. Previous statement in writing is used in section 145. A witness may be cross-examined so as to previous statements made by him in writing are reduced into writing and relevant to matters in question without such writing being shown him or being proved. But if it is intended to contradict him by the writing, his attention must, before the writing can be proved, be called to those parts of it which are to be used for the purpose of contradicting them. So, for the purpose of contradiction, previous statement in writing can be referred to in the cross-examination. Now, section 157 is there. In 157, there is a word used as former statement. Former statement of witnesses may be proved to corroborate later testimony as to the same fact. So, former statement means former statement can be used for the purpose of corroboration, but previous statement in writing can be used for the purpose of contradicting. Why the framers of the Indian Evidence Act has used two different words, former statement and previous statement. In section 145, it was previous statement in writing, whereas it is the former statement of a witness to corroborate. Therefore, there are difference between a former statement and previous statement as used by in section 145 and 157. This distinction has to be drawn by the lawyer by applying his practical knowledge, by applying his practical experience. What is the difference between a previous statement and former statement? Former statement is used for corroboration, whereas the previous statement has to be used for the contradiction. Now that three important things we can do for the purpose of cross-examinations. They are lawful in cross-examinations. Section 146, the words used by the framers of Indian Evidence Act is questions lawful in cross-examination. When a witness is cross-examined, he may, in addition to the questions herein before referred to be asked, that is leading questions, questions with answers, witness to characters, all those things, and then may be asked to any questions which tend to test his veracity. First thing is, questions may be put in the cross-examination to test his veracity, and questions may be put to discover who he is. Witness, where are you from? You are not so and so. The police has produced you by naming X, but you are not X. For to that extent, to discover who he is, who is he, and what is his position in life. He said, I am capable of giving 1 crore loan, but we have to ascertain in the cross-examination, we have to make it known in the cross-examination that he is not in a position to lend a sum of rupees 1 crore. So, the cross-examinations, certain questions are lawful. One is to test the veracity of the witness, and second thing is to discover who he is and what is his position in life. Or the third thing is very important, to shake his credit by injuring his character. Even you can injure the character of a witness in the course of cross-examination, although the answer to such question might tend directly or indirectly to criminate him, or might expose or tend directly or indirectly to expose him to a penalty or forfeiture. So during the cross examination, a lawyer is enjoying powers, prerogatives, privileges to put questions which may tend to test the veracity, to discover who is the witness, to discover what is the position of the witness in his life, what is his position, or to shake the credit by injuring his character, although the answer to such questions might tend directly or indirectly to criminate him, or might tend directly or indirectly to expose him to a penalty or forfeiture. That was the right given to the advocate to extract the truth from the witness under section 146. Then 147, section 147 and 132 to be read. It is about the when witness to be compelled to answer. The next thing is section 148, where the court to decide when questions shall be asked when witness compelled to answer. It is the liberty and discretion given to the court. If any question relates to a matter not relevant to the suit or proceedings, except in so far as it affects the credit of the witnesses by injuring his character, the court shall decide whether or not the witness shall be compelled to answer it, and may, if it thinks fit, warn the witness that he is not obliged to answer it. In exercising in his discretion, the court shall have regard to the following considerations. These are all the things the court has given the liberty even to warn the witnesses. And with that, sir, questions not to be asked without reasonable ground. That is the in section 146, certain privileges and rights are given to a lawyer. But such questions referred in section 148 are to be asked unless the person asking it has a reasonable ground for thinking that the imputation which it conveys is well founded. This is a restriction imposed upon putting unscrupulous questions. With that, the 154 is one important provision. The court may, in its discretion, permit the person who calls a witness to put any questions to him which might be put in cross-examination by the adverse party. Nothing in this section shall disentitle a person so permitted under section 1 to rely on any part of the evidence of such witness. Here, section 154 is dealing with the popular word we are using in the court corridors, hostile witness. Hostile witness is a term alien to the Evidence Act. It is a term that we are using in our practice, but the court has not used, the framers of Evidence Act has not used the word hostile witness. The court may, in its discretion, permit the person who calls a witness to put the questions, because if the witness has not disclosed the material facts for which he was summoned, then the party who called the witness is entitled to cross-examine him with the permission of the court. A permission has to be obtained by the court, from the court, and the party can cross-examine him. But the evidence of a hostile witness, that is what, nothing in this section shall disentitle the person so permitted under subsection 1 to rely on any part of the evidence of such witness. If a person has turned hostile, or if a person was cross-examined under section 154 of the Evidence Act, by the party who called him as a witness merely because he was cross-examined. The witness, the evidence need not be discarded in toto. Any part of it can be relied upon by the party who brought it, who has brought it to the court. And then the important provision is 167, no trial, no new trial for improper admission or rejection of evidence. Merely because there was an improper admission or there was an improper rejection of evidence, no new trial can be permitted to order. There are powers of the judges to put questions or order production. There are powers judges may, in order to or to discover, obtain proper proof of relevant fact, the judges can also put questions. And then, what is the remedy available to a witness in a criminal case threatened to give false evidence? A witness was threatened. What is the remedy? The remedy is, as per the amendment introduced by Act 5 of 2009, with effect from 31/12/2009 in CRPC, Section 195A, a witness or any person may file a complaint in relation to an offense of threatening to give false evidence. If any witnesses are threatened, the witness can give a complaint under Section 195A IPC. Both the sections are 195A. The complaint has to be filed under Section 195A CRPC and under section for the offense under Section 195 IPC. This is the amendment introduced from 16/4/2006. The procedure is just summary procedure. What is the punishment and procedure for non-attendance by a witness in obedience of summons? See, if a summons is emanated from the court, if a person is summoned by the court, but he has not appeared before the court, there is no provision in Indian Evidence Act as to what to do if a witness on receipt of a summons did not appear before the court. Section 350 CRPC is dealing with the witness who has not appeared. Section 350 CRPC dealing with the witness who has not appeared. I shall read Section 350, which will be useful for the reference here. If any witness being summoned to appear before a criminal court is legally bound to appear at a certain place and time in obedience to the summons and without just excuse, neglects or refuses to attend at that place or time or departs, then if the court, if the witness satisfied that there is expedient in the interest of justice that such a witness should be tried summarily, the court may take cognizance of the offense and after giving offender an opportunity of showing cause why he should not be punished under this section, sentence him fine not exceeding 100 rupees. Therefore, under Section 350, if a witness who upon whom a summon has been duly served, but he is not obeying the summon, he has not appeared, and he has also not shown a sufficient cause for the notice given to him. In such cases, after providing an opportunity to the witness, a summary procedure has to be adopted, and after the summary procedure, fine can be imposed upon the witness for not exceeding 100 rupees under Section 350 CPC. Witnesses are eyes and ears of justice. This is what Jeremy Bentham has told. The great jurist Jeremy Bentham has told. While we are talking about the witnesses, I would like to invite your attention into the judgment that was reported, that is Shivkripal Singh versus V.V. Giri. It is a very, very interesting judgment in the world, not in India. It is in the world. It is an interesting judgment. There was, I am referring to the Hindu paper of April 21, 1970, but you can also refer the judgment in Indian Kanun, Shivkripal Singh versus V.V. Giri. It is also reported in CDJ 1970 SC 131. V.V. Giri, His Excellency V.V. Giri, was the fourth president of India. The president of India, his election was challenged by Shivkripal Singh. V.V. Giri was the fourth president of India. He was elected, but his election was challenged by Shivkripal Singh before the Supreme Court of India. In the election petition number 1, 3, 4, and 5 of 1969, it was a peculiar situation before the Supreme Court. There was a necessity for the President of India, who has been elected by the Electoral Collegium as the President of India, to adduce an evidence and appear as a witness. But on April 20, 1970, the Indian Supreme Court has created a history. President, His Excellency V.V. Giri, on 20th April 1970, appeared before the Supreme Court and he gave evidence before the Supreme Court in the presidential election case. This was the first time in the nation's president had appeared before a court of law. The appearance of the president, the authority for appointing Supreme Court judges. The President of India is an authority for the Supreme Court judges. He is an appointing authority for the Supreme Court judges. But when a situation arises, when a case pertaining to the election of the President of India came up before the Supreme Court, the President himself appeared before the Supreme Court, and one senior advocate said that it signified the majesty of law and the utmost respect of the head of state shows that to the supreme judiciary of the land and the rule of law underlying the basic fabric of our constitution. See, I'm going to read what has happened immediately when Justice Giri, the President of India, appeared before the Supreme Court of India. Though the President Giri, as head of the state, was entitled to be examined on commission, a commissioner might have been appointed for examination of witnesses, and he is entitled to be examined on commission, and the court had granted the plea for such an examination in Rashtrapati Bhavan itself. But the President of India gave up the privilege and submitted himself to the jurisdiction of the court as any other witnesses. It is very important. The President of India has gave up the privileges and immunities and submitted himself to the jurisdiction of court as any other witnesses. There was speculation earlier if the judges would rise when Mr. Giri entered the courtroom. They did not, nor did they acknowledge Mr. Giri's namaste. They maintained their usual dispassionate composure. The judges have not even acknowledged the namaste offered by the then President of India, and they maintained their usual discompassionate composure. They have not even acknowledged him. But a President of India has appeared in a case before the Supreme Court, and he entered into the witness box, and he has been examined and cross-examined by the court, and that is the perhaps the rule of law prevailed and supremacy of the judiciary in India. With that, I would like to conclude the lecture